January 1945. A cold morning settles over a prisoner of war camp in the American Midwest. Snow rests quietly along the wooden barracks. Barbed wire stretches across the horizon. But beyond it, there are no explosions, no sirens, no burning cities. Only silence broken by the sound of boots crunching on frozen ground. Inside one of the barracks, a group of German women sit wrapped in borrowed coats. Some are nurses, some clerks, some civilians swept into uniform by a collapsing Reich. Their hands tremble not from fear of violence, but from disbelief. They are prisoners. Yet they are fed, they are guarded, and they are safe. Thousands of miles away, Germany is burning. Entire cities reduced to rubble. Families scattered or dead. But here, in the heart of the country they were taught to fear most, the war feels distant, almost unreal. For many of these women, captivity in America will become the safest place. They have known since the war began, and to understand how this impossible contradiction came to be, we must step back into the final, desperate years of the Second World War. By the winter of 1944, the Third Reich was collapsing from every direction. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army had pushed through Poland, leaving shattered German divisions in retreat. Entire towns vanished behind the Soviet advance. Civilians fled westward in endless columns, often under artillery fire. In the air, Allied bombers struck German cities day and night, turning industrial centers into fields of ash. The German war economy was exhausted. Manpower was gone. Teenagers and elderly men filled the ranks. Women once shielded from direct military involvement were now drawn into every role the state could assign. They served as nurses, radio operators, clerks, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, and administrative personnel for the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. By late 1944, many of these women found themselves trapped behind collapsing front lines. Some were captured in France as Allied forces surged east after D-Day. Others were taken during the Ardennes counteroffensive, when German formations disintegrated under American pressure. Still more surrendered in Italy, the Low Countries, or in ports along the Atlantic coast. The capture of German women was never a central feature of Allied planning, but it became unavoidable. As the war consumed everything in its path, under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were entitled to food, shelter, medical care, and protection from violence. The United States had committed publicly to these standards. Yet for the women now in Allied custody, legality offered little reassurance. They had grown up under constant propaganda. America was portrayed as ruthless, decadent, and cruel. Stories circulated of mistreatment, revenge, and humiliation. As these women boarded transport ships bound west, they believed they were being sent into enemy territory where survival was uncertain. What they could not know was that America had already prepared for something few expected: the large-scale housing of enemy prisoners on its own soil. And that preparation would change everything. The United States began preparing for the arrival of Axis prisoners long before German women ever crossed the Atlantic. By 1942, Tens of thousands of Italian and German POWs were already being held across America. Remote camps appeared in Texas, Arizona, Colorado, the Midwest, and along the East Coast. The locations were deliberate, far from ports, far from cities, and far from any realistic chance of escape. By 1944, the U.S. held more than 370,000 German prisoners of war. Among them were small but growing numbers of women, most classified as auxiliary personnel or civilian attachments to military units. American policy toward POWs was shaped by more than law. It was shaped by strategy. U.S. leadership believed that humane treatment could weaken enemy morale, encourage surrender, and demonstrate moral contrast with Nazi ideology. Camps were designed to meet Geneva standards strictly. Barracks were heated. Medical staff were assigned. Food rations often matched or exceeded those of American civilians under wartime restrictions. For German women arriving in America, the shock was immediate. They were separated from male prisoners and housed in secured sections. Guards were professional, distant, but rarely brutal. There were roll calls, inspections, and strict routines, but also structure, predictability, and order for many. This order felt unfamiliar. Back in Germany, Allied bombing had destroyed water systems, hospitals, and transport. Hunger was constant. Fear was relentless. News from home arrived slowly, often filtered or censored, but what did come confirmed their worst fears. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden were burning. Families were missing. The future was unknowable. Inside American camps, life was still confined, but it was stable. And in that stability, a strange realization began to take hold. Captivity here did not resemble the terror they had been taught to expect. It resembled safety. And that realization would quietly reshape how these women understood the enemy and the war itself. For German women in American captivity, survival was no longer a daily question. Meals arrived on schedule. Bread was fresh. Soup was hot. Medical treatment was available without bribes or fear. In many camps, women were issued clean clothing, hygiene supplies, and blankets, items that had become luxuries in wartime Germany. The contrast was unsettling. Letters from home described bombed neighborhoods, overcrowded shelters, and the disappearance of relatives. Mothers spoke of children sent away to escape air raids. Sisters wrote of ration cards that no longer guaranteed food. Here, inside enemy territory, the women slept without the sound of aircraft overhead. Guards addressed them formally. Abuse was rare and punished when reported. For many prisoners, the fear of violence slowly faded, not because captivity ended, but because danger no longer defined each moment. This did not erase guilt or loyalty. Many still believed in Germany. Many worried constantly about those left behind. But safety has a way of cutting through ideology. And for the first time in years, some of these women began to sleep through the night. The war had trained them to expect cruelty. Instead, they encountered rules. American guards followed procedures. Inspections were routine, not punitive. Discipline existed, but it was predictable. And predictability, after years of chaos, carried its own relief, slowly, perceptions shifted. The enemy did not shout slogans. The enemy did not demand loyalty oaths. The enemy did not strike without reason. This did not turn prisoners into sympathizers, but it forced comparison. If this was the enemy, then what had Germany become? That question lingered quietly in barracks and mess halls, unspoken but present. And it would grow sharper as the war neared its end. The safety these women experienced was not accidental. American POW policy was tightly regulated and constantly inspected. Camp commanders were held personally responsible for compliance with the Geneva Convention. International Red Cross representatives were allowed access. Violations, when discovered, led to formal investigations. This discipline served a purpose. U.S. officials believed that humane treatment undermined Nazi propaganda more effectively than brutality ever could. A prisoner who was fed, sheltered, and treated according to law was less likely to resist and more likely to remember the contrast. For German women, this meant lives governed by structure rather than terror. Work assignments were limited and non-combatant. Many assisted with laundry, food preparation, or clerical tasks inside the camps. Education programs were offered in some locations, language classes, basic training, even supervised recreation. The camps were not free places. Barbed wire remained. Armed guards remained. But within those boundaries, the rules were consistent. And consistency in wartime can feel like protection for years. America had been presented as a land of moral decay and racial chaos. What the prisoners saw instead were ordinary people. Farmers delivering supplies, nurses treating wounds, guards writing letters home during quiet shifts, civilians living without air raids, without blackouts, without ruins surrounding them. This exposure did not erase national identity, but it cracked certainty. Some women later described shame not at being captured, but at realizing how deeply they had been misled. The enemy was not a monster. The enemy was organized, distant, and frighteningly stable. And as Allied forces closed in on Berlin, that realization became impossible to ignore. Spring 1945 brought news that changed everything. It did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, scarred conversations overheard in passing, Red Cross notices, radio bulletins filtered through camp administration. But the message was unmistakable. Germany was finished. American newspapers spoke openly of Allied troops crossing the Rhine, of Soviet forces entering Berlin, of cities no longer described as targets, but as ruins. For the German women inside U.S. camps, this knowledge carried a sharp, conflicting weight. They were prisoners of a war that was ending, yet they were also protected from its final violence. In April, reports reached the camps of mass displacement across Germany, of civilians fleeing without food or shelter, of hospitals overwhelmed, of entire regions without order or authority. Some women realized something deeply unsettling. If they had not been captured, if they had remained in Germany, they might now be refugees or dead. Instead, they were alive, fed, sheltered, under guard, but untouched by the collapse consuming their homeland. This realization did not come with celebration. It came with silence. In barracks at night, Women lay awake listening to the quiet. No bombers, no artillery, only wind against wooden walls. And in that quiet, a single thought emerged with increasing clarity. Captivity here had become safer than freedom at home. In May 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The announcement reached American POW camps with formal restraint. There were no speeches, no celebrations, just a change in status from enemy prisoners to displaced survivors of a defeated state. For the German women, the war ended without explosions, but its meaning arrived all at once. Guards relaxed procedures, restrictions eased, discussions about repatriation began. For many prisoners, this should have been a moment of relief. Instead, it brought fear. What awaited them in Germany was no longer a nation, but a landscape of ruins. Transportation systems were destroyed. Housing was scarce. Food shortages were severe. Law and order varied by occupation zone. Some women asked quietly whether they could remain longer, not because they wished to stay prisoners, but because the camp represented stability. It represented survival. In interviews conducted decades later, several former POWs described this period as emotionally inverted. They felt gratitude toward their captors and dread toward their homeland. This did not mean loyalty had vanished. It meant reality had intruded. The war had promised protection through strength. What remained was destruction, and the safest place they had known in years stood behind American wire. As repatriation plans moved forward, the women prepared to leave not victory behind them, but shelter. And the consequences of that contrast would follow them for the rest of their lives. The return to Germany began slowly. Transportation was limited. Allied authorities prioritized medical cases and civilians without family support. When German women finally boarded trains or trucks heading east, they left behind camps that, despite captivity, had provided food, warmth, and predictability. What awaited them was not home. Cities lay flattened. Rail lines were twisted metal. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to open ground. In many areas, water systems did not function. Electricity was unreliable or absent. Families were often gone. Some women arrived to find their houses destroyed. Others learned that parents or siblings had been killed during bombing raids or displaced beyond tracing. Food rations were minimal. Disease spread quickly in overcrowded shelters. The psychological impact was severe. Former prisoners struggled to explain their experiences. To say that captivity in America had felt safer than Germany sounded disloyal or worse, ungrateful to those who had suffered and died. So many remained silent. They rebuilt their lives quietly. They married, they worked, they adapted to occupation and division. But the memory remained sharp and unresolved, because the war had taught them an impossible truth. That safety had come not from victory, but from defeat. In the decades that followed, fragments of these experiences surfaced slowly. They appeared in memoirs written late in life, in oral history interviews conducted by German and American historians, in quiet statements that began the same way. It is difficult to explain. Many former POWs struggled with guilt. They had survived the war largely intact, while others endured starvation, violence, and displacement. Some questioned whether their sense of safety in America invalidated the suffering of those left behind. But historians found consistency in their accounts. American camps were orderly, food was sufficient, medical care was reliable, violence was rare. These facts were confirmed by Red Cross inspections and U.S. military records. What lingered most was not gratitude but contrast. The women remembered the sound of silence at night, the absence of fear, the shock of realizing that the enemy they had been taught to fear had followed the rules more closely than their own collapsing state. This did not absolve the war. It did not erase responsibility or loss, but it complicated memory for these women. World War II was not a single narrative of victim and aggressor. It was a sequence of environments, some brutal, some unexpectedly humane, and the safest chapter of all had unfolded behind enemy wire, a reality that still unsettles. History.war is often remembered through battles and leaders, but its truth lives in quieter places, in camps far from the front lines, in women caught between collapsing nations, in moments where ideology meets reality and fails. For German women, held as prisoners in America, safety arrived in the most unlikely form. Not through victory, not through escape, but through surrender to an enemy bound by law, distance, and restraint. This does not rewrite history, it deepens it. Because World War II was not only a story of destruction, it was a test of systems, values, and human behavior under pressure. And in rare spaces, those systems held. Barbed wire remained. Freedom was delayed, but dignity survived. And when these women returned to a broken homeland, they carried with them a memory that refused to fade, that even in war, humanity can appear where it is least expected, not loudly, not heroically, but quietly in the absence of fear.